Okay, hello, welcome to this Oxford University History Society talk. My name is Jacob. I'm the president for Michaelmas, co-president for Michaelmas 2022. So today we're very glad to be joined by Kenan Cruz Çilli, who is a writer and researcher focused on minority identity and the politics of cultural heritage in Turkey. He holds an MSc in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Oxford, and his written work has been featured in a number of publications, including Middle East Eye, the Sunday Times, Haaretz, and the Ajam Media Collective. So, Kenan, I believe you have a presentation. Please feel free to take it away.
Of course. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Let me just quickly share my presentation. Hi, everyone. I'm Kenan Cruz Çilli, as mentioned. Today, I'll be talking about memory, politics, and heritage conservation in Turkey. More specifically, I'll be introducing you to some key themes in the world of Turkish heritage studies. In today's presentation, I'll mostly be focusing on the city of Istanbul, looking into the ways that different ideologies have come to shape the physical city and its built environment in the present day. Now, Istanbul, as an intercontinental hub of commerce and trade, and as the former cultural and political center of successive massive empires, has been a historic home to countless distinct ethnic, linguistic, and religious communities, and has always been a world city in the truest sense of the word. Throughout the centuries, the city has come to signify a multitude of complex meanings in popular national, religious, and political imaginaries. These understandings of what Istanbul means and represents often intertwine and overlap. At other times, they contradict and clash as the city, its history and heritage, and its role in the world today evoke an abundance of meanings. Depending on what lens we look through, Istanbul could be Constantinople, a Byzantine capital, the fallen city of Christendom. It could be seen as Islambol or Der Saadet, which was an Islamic city whose conquest was prophesied by the Prophet Muhammad. Istanbul could be Kushta, as many Jewish people call the city, as a home to Jewish communities from around the world who found refuge in the city. It could also be known as Tsarigrad, which is the imperial city, which is how it's known in Bulgarian, as the city was once home to the largest Bulgarian community in the world, more so than Sofia and Plovdiv. Depending on how you choose to interpret the city, the built environment has a multitude of complex layers that tell the story that you're looking for. In order to understand some of these meanings and the ways in which ideology and power help shape the way we view the city, I've decided to delve into three themes in this lecture. Firstly, I'll be looking into Byzantine heritage and national identity, before moving on to gentrification and the erasure of urban memory. And finally, I'll be talking about cosmopolitan nostalgia and minority heritage by looking into the role that minority heritage plays in the city today and in Turkey overall. What ties these three subjects together and what informs a lot of heritage studies in the present day is the impact that different ideologies have on the cities in which we live. The present day, the buildings and monuments that we see around us, and perhaps more importantly, the ones we don't see around us, may seem arbitrary or incidental, or perhaps just a natural progression of history. However, the built environment is constantly being shaped and reshaped, molded, altered, and redefined in line with the prevalent ideologies in a given place. In this sense, cities can be seen as symbolic representations of the various ideologies that have and continue to coexist in a certain polity. To make this point a little more clear, I've written up some of the major ideologies that have shaped Istanbul into the city it is today. There's Ottomanism, the idea that sort of came about in the 19th century when the Ottoman Empire was in decline, that sort of came about as a response to growing nationalism throughout the empire among the different groups living within the empire. Ottomanism sort of thought was this idea that all citizens in the Ottoman Empire will now be equal subjects of the Sultan, meaning that Jews, Christians, be they Armenian or Greek, and Muslims would be equal and would have equal rights and equal representation in the empire. Ottomanism impacted the city in many ways. For instance, there's an almshouse in Istanbul called the Darul Acize, where there is a synagogue and a church that share the same building, built in the late 1800s, and a mosque just across, which is something we see nowadays in cities like Berlin and Abu Dhabi, but that existed in Istanbul in the 19th century. Other ideologies that have impacted the city are classicalism, Islamism, nationalism, Kemalism, secularism, globalization, cosmopolitan nostalgia, neo-Ottomanism, neoliberalism, westernization, and modernization. The impact of these different ideologies will become more apparent throughout this presentation. But of course, Istanbul hasn't always been the Istanbul it is today. As the largest metropolis in the Turkish Republic, for centuries, it was the seat of the Ottoman Empire, and before that, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the center of the Orthodox world, and a large and powerful successor state of the Roman Empire. Byzantine Istanbul was a city well known for its churches, its mighty city walls, its many cisterns, aqueducts, and its famous hippodrome. Here is a representation, a depiction of Byzantine Istanbul or Constantinople. You can see the city walls, the hippodrome, which to some extent is still standing, the Hagia Sophia, which later became a church and then a mosque and then a museum and then a mosque, the Bukoleon Palace, which was a prominent seaside waterfront palace of the Byzantine Empire. The Great Palace was behind it, and you can see several other churches throughout. But of course, the Byzantine Empire hasn't existed for over 550 years. So it's worthwhile asking what remains of Byzantine heritage in Istanbul today, and how this heritage is preserved or not preserved, and how does national identity impact the way in which Byzantine heritage is seen. Istanbul's Hagia Sophia is a prime example of a tangible heritage site whose function has been altered frequently and repeatedly, reflecting not only the significance of the monument as a symbolic representation of Turkish identity, but also mirroring the shifts in power and ideology within the Turkish nation state. The Hagia Sophia has a long and multifaceted history as one of the most well-known monuments on the planet. It was built in the 6th century as a church, later became, during the Crusades, was briefly used as a Catholic church, then later became an Orthodox church again, and in 1453, following the Ottoman conquest, became a mosque, then later in 1935 became a museum, then later became a mosque again in 2020, as I'm sure many of you know. But following the proclamation of the Turkish Republic in 1923, Turkey underwent a series of secularizing reforms that aimed at modernizing and westernizing the nation state. These reforms, executed by the founder of the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, sought to create a new modern nation state that would stand in stark contrast to the perceived backwardness that was attributed to the demise of the Ottoman Empire. One of the key ideological pillars of modern Turkish identity thus became secularism, an ideology that was central to the reforms implemented in the early decades of Republican Turkey. In this same period, the Hagia Sophia was selected as a monument that would serve as one of the greatest examples of the secular character of the new Turkish Republic. The building was closed to the public in 1931, and following a period of restoration, the Hagia Sophia was reopened not as a mosque, but as a museum. The site was reconfigured into a very carefully curated museological space in which religious practice of any confession was restricted, while both Christian and Muslim heritage and iconography in the building was repurposed and put on display. As you can see here, this is a picture of the Hagia Sophia while it was still serving as a museum. You can see that these large panels with Arabic calligraphy, this one says Allah, the one beside it says Muhammad, and I think there's 4 others with the names of each of the caliphs, the first 4 caliphs. And they stand side by side with the Byzantine era mosaics. This is a depiction of Mary and Jesus. And these are the later additions to the interior, the mihrab, which points to Mecca, and the minbar. Nowadays, of course, the parts, the mosaics, for instance, have been covered up as the building has been turned back into a mosque. In time, the Hagia Sophia became not only a monument that encapsulated the ethos of Turkish secular modernity, but also a site that acted as a universal model for policies relating to the management of cultural heritage sites with long and multi-layered histories. The Hagia Sophia also served as a model for the continuous practice of secularizing religious sites throughout Turkey in the decades to come. This was the case with numerous churches and mosques around the country, including monuments such as the Kora Monastery in Istanbul, as well as a number of other historic monuments from Trabzon to Iznik all over the country. The status of the Hagia Sophia as a museum was subject to harsh criticism from Turkey's Islamists. For decades, campaigns were waged by Turkey's religiously oriented conservative class, advocating for the restoration of Islamic worship in this secularized site. These campaigns focused aggressively on the Hagia Sophia, owing to its status as one of the most emblematic and noteworthy landmarks of Istanbul's Ottoman conquest, and its function as a symbolic representation of Kemalist ideology and Turkish secularism alike. Following the rise to power of the religiously conservative AKP in 2002, state attitudes towards secularism gradually began to shift away from the previously dominant understanding of the early republic. Consecutive AKP governments under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan sought to reverse early Republican secularization efforts by annulling the museumification of churches turned mosques throughout Turkey. This policy reached its apex in July 2020, when President Erdogan declared that the Hagia Sophia's long-held status as a museum was to be annulled and that the monument was to reopen as a mosque. This move sparked outrage not only among secular segments of Turkish society, who feared the gradual encroachment of Islamism in the public sphere, but also among international institutions such as UNESCO and Christian leaders around the world who saw the move as an act of religious provocation. With the reconversion of the mighty Hagia Sophia into a mosque, Erdogan was successfully able to dismantle one of the most evocative and enduring symbols of secular republicanism in Turkey, marking a major repositioning in the country's national identity. In a speech following the declaration of the Hagia Sophia's reconversion, President Erdogan presented himself as the inheritor and enactor of the will of Mehmet the Conqueror, outlining both the neo-Ottomanist and religiously motivated character that defines his vision for Turkey. President Erdogan's ability to exert control over the function of the Hagia Sophia highlights how power plays a major role in the interpretation and usage of the past in the production of national identity in the present. Just as it did for Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in the past, the Hagia Sophia as a monument was repurposed to serve a new political function, indicating the malleable nature of cultural heritage sites. Successive political leaders in Turkey, from Atatürk to Erdogan, have utilized cultural heritage policy as a means to mold the identity of the nation in accordance to social and political considerations. This is a beautiful mosaic in the interior of Hagia Sophia, which is unfortunately mostly covered up these days. You can see two Byzantine emperors on either side of a depiction of Mary and Jesus. I believe it's Justinian on the left and Constantine on the right. And what's interesting is that Justinian is holding and presenting a little model of the Hagia Sophia itself to Mary and Jesus. And this can be seen in various Byzantine era churches, not just in Istanbul, such as in Kora Monastery and the Cathedral of St. George, but also throughout the former Byzantine Empire. You may be asking, what is the case for other Byzantine sites throughout the city? Unfortunately, most Byzantine sites in Istanbul have been left in a very derelict state for decades. The walls of Constantinople have been struggling to stay standing. It's a miracle that they are standing. There were plans in the 1980s to demolish them to create a more modern look for Istanbul. Thankfully, they survived the calls in the 1980s to be demolished, but they remained derelict for decades, centuries. And the Bukoleon Palace, as you can see on the right, had a similar fate. However, the recently elected mayor of Istanbul, was elected 3 years ago, I suppose now, has made tangible efforts to preserve certain Byzantine sites, focusing mostly on non-religious sites. So the walls and the Bukoleon Palace are a good example of that. Certain sections of the Justinian walls have been restored and reopened in recent months. Can now be visited with a new visitor center, and the Bukoleon Palace, for the first time in, I think, its history, has been the site of excavation works, where the oldest fountain in Istanbul was discovered. And you can now visit not only the excavation works, but also other sites in Istanbul that are being restored at the hands of the opposition-led municipality. The Bukoleon Palace is also set to reopen as an open-air museum sometime in the future, probably within the next 2 years. Another important Byzantine site in Istanbul is the Hippodrome, or what's left of the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome was this large circus, as they call it, where Byzantines would go to watch chariots being raced, or horses racing, which at the time was a pastime that was very much in vogue. You can't really see much of the Hippodrome in this picture on the right, other than the Sphenodome, which is one of the main bits that is left, because much of the Hippodrome is now underground. But the center of the Hippodrome, which is over here, the square, has these big monuments around which the horses and the chariots would be racing. And there have been plans recently by Ekrem İmamoğlu, so the new mayor of Istanbul, to bring to light parts of the Hippodrome that have been covered up and have sort of disappeared. He sees massive touristic potential in it and sees it as an important part of Istanbul's heritage. However, his plans to excavate parts of the Hippodrome and reveal the city's Byzantine heritage have been met with a lot of backlash from nationalist and Islamist circles, who have, I'm not going to translate all of these headlines from Turkish newspapers, but this one on the left accuses İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, of being Greek or a descendant of Greeks, Another one mentions that the municipality has a love for Byzantium. And this one over here mentions that Imamoglu, the mayor, has a plan to bring back the Byzantine Empire. So as you can see, questions regarding heritage still play a vital role in the way that politics takes place in Turkey today. Moving on to the next topic, gentrification and the erasure of urban memory. The production of heritage, meaning the decision-making processes that determine what elements, both physical and abstract, are deemed worthy of preservation and heritagization, is a process that develops in close relation to power dynamics. Much like the production of history, the process of determining what heritage is deemed worthy of being recorded, conserved, and safeguarded for future generations is decided by the dominant groups within a society, be they the political, religious, military, or social elites. Throughout the world, the heritage of the subaltern, those disenfranchised and silenced groups whose history is often ignored, tends to be sidelined and vulnerable. In Istanbul too, the history and heritage of subordinate, non-elite individuals or communities such as the working class, women, ethnic and religious minorities, prostitutes, criminals, and the LGBT community is in a particularly vulnerable position, as this heritage is too often seen as being unworthy of preservation. In the 1980s, the development of tourism as a major economic industry worldwide came hand in hand with the blossoming of a global heritage industry, whereby monuments and cultural heritage sites gained significant economic potential and value. As a result, sites that were previously of little importance to the state, that had suffered from decades of neglect and misuse, began to garner newfound recognition and merit a novel sense of utility. Furthermore, the rise of tourism as an important economic resource brought with it a new actor in the production of heritage in the form of the private sector. Tourism and a neoliberalist for-profit mentality have taken a massive toll on Turkish cities since the 1980s, when Turkey was integrated into the global network of neoliberal economies under Prime Minister Turgut Özal. The mayor of Istanbul at the time, Bedrettin Dalan, advocated for the demolition of entire waterfront neighborhoods with the aim of creating new spaces for international investment as Turkey opened itself up to the free market. These forces continue to influence massive changes in Istanbul today, as can be seen in the neighborhood of Galata. In early 2022, major demolitions took place in this neighborhood. A series of excavators began to tear down dozens of buildings, many of which dated back to the late Ottoman period. Authorities claimed the demolitions which occurred in and around the steep cobblestone Zürafa Sokak alleyway, which is this street here that winds up from Karaköy to Galata, were part of a major so-called cultural renewal project. However, in reality, these demolitions served to erase an important aspect of Istanbul's history, because for many decades, this area was home to a dense cluster of state-sanctioned brothels, giving the neighborhood the nickname of Istanbul's red light district. The history of Zürafa Sokak goes back to the late Ottoman era, when Sultan Abdülhamit II allowed for the opening of the first brothels in this area. Many of the brothels here were owned and administered by the wealthy Turkish-Armenian proprietress Matilde Manukyan, who accumulated massive profits from her various businesses, earning her the title of Turkey's top taxpayer for several years throughout the 1990s. When the demolitions took place, Turkish media was quick to announce the discovery of remnants of an 18th century hammam, or Turkish bath, in the area. However, little focus was given to the fact that the hammam itself was only discovered after the 200-year-old brothel was demolished. This example clearly indicates how the local government and the state are biased in heritage conservation, choosing to highlight archaeological ruins over the physical history and heritage of the thousands of women who worked in Istanbul's sex industry over the centuries. Another interesting thing that you can see in this picture is this building here on the right and this building here on the left. They are both synagogues. The one on the left is the Grand Ashkenazi Synagogue of Istanbul, the only active Ashkenazi synagogue in the whole of Turkey today. And it was built by wealthier Austrian Jews with support from the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. The one on the right was built by socially disenfranchised Ashkenazi women and men. Most of the women worked as sex workers in this neighborhood. And even the current state of both of these buildings reflects the way that class sort of has a role in the way in which cultural heritage sites are preserved in the present day. The temple on the left, the Ashkenazi temple on the left, the Grand Austrian Temple, is in great condition today. It's still used actively as a synagogue, owing to the fact that it was once the house of prayer for wealthier Ashkenazi elite, whereas the other Ashkenazi synagogue, which is just a stone's throw away, is derelict and has been for several decades, owing to the fact that it belongs to socially disenfranchised women and men from poorer backgrounds. So when I was in Istanbul in September, I asked a few local shopkeepers in this area what they thought of the demolitions. One shopkeeper laughed when I mentioned the idea of a cultural corridor, which was being touted by the local authorities, revealing his concerns that the entire site would be rebuilt with luxury boutique hotels. He went on to criticize the lack of communication between the agents of gentrification and the local residents and workers. So as power and politics come together to shape and reshape the urban space, in the case of Zürafa Sokak, authorities have decided to selectively demolish reminders of prostitution in Istanbul, erasing the memory of the women who have worked in the neighborhood since late Ottoman times. Here are some more pictures I took when I visited the area in September. And if you want an indication of what the area might come to look like in the next few years, not too far away, perhaps just a 5-minute walk from Zürafa Sokak, is the Galata Port area, which has recently been redeveloped, making it almost indistinguishable from other retail, shopping, commercial spaces in the Western world. If it weren't for the mosque in the background, for instance, this picture could be anywhere. So Galata Port is located in Karaköy, where it used to be a famous place for shipping, and there were many warehouses there, and it was sort of a working class area that has been transformed into a completely touristic and commercialized neoliberal shopping space based entirely on consumption. The building on the right was once a post office in the late Ottoman Empire and a customs house, and it has been converted into a boutique shopping center with more than 70 boutique boutique shops inside. This area has also become a major cruise ship stop, where massive cruise ships full of tourists come and enjoy Istanbul's M&Ss and Zaras. Thankfully, the projects to restore the area and sort of create Galata Port as a new commercial space also did take into account a little bit of the restoration of the historic heritage in the area. This was also very selective. There were loads of demolitions. Only certain sites were deemed worthy of preservation, such as this clock tower on the left. It's one of the first clock towers to be built in the Ottoman Empire, when the empire decided to standardize time. And this mosque, which was also built by an Armenian architect. Moving on to the third topic, which is minority heritage and cosmopolitan nostalgia. So as we mentioned, today's Turkey is in many, many ways a vastly different state from its Ottoman predecessor. In Istanbul, at the start of the 20th century, Muslims represented less than half of the city's population, with the city's non-Muslim communities, comprised of Greeks, Armenians, Jews, other Christians, and resident foreigners, constituting a modest majority. In the minds of Turkish reformers, it was precisely this form of cosmopolitanism that was in part to blame for the downfall of the Ottoman Empire. Diversity was seen as a major obstacle to the unity of the nation, and the nation's non-Muslim elements were perceived as disloyal citizens who threatened the territorial integrity of the state. The vigorously nationalist context in which Turkey's transition from a multi-confessional empire to a contemporary nation-state occurred resulted in unprecedented changes in the demographic makeup of Anatolia and Thrace. The desire to create a homogeneous Turkish nation-state paved the way for a range of policies that aimed to minimize the non-Muslim presence and influence in Turkey. These policies, ranging from a population exchange with Greece to assimilatory linguistic campaigns and discriminatory policies in taxation and employment, were all contributing factors that led to a sharp decline in Turkey's non-Muslim populations. Later on, beginning in the 1980s, Istanbul's population began to grow exponentially as Turkish and Kurdish migrants from throughout Anatolia made their way to Istanbul in search of economic opportunities or political refuge. These migratory waves significantly changed the demographic makeup of many of the city's historic districts. Neighborhoods such as Balat, Fener, Hasköy, Kumkapı, and Kuzguncuk that were traditionally inhabited by Istanbul's minority communities became inhabited by these new migrants. As the city's remaining minorities began to settle in newly constructed suburbs further out the city or abroad. As these changes in the era of globalization led to the perceived disappearance of the pluralist atmosphere of old Istanbul, the phenomenon of cosmopolitan nostalgia rose to prominence in the city. Nostalgia, or a lost cosmopolitanism, includes nostalgia for all the elements of pluralist conviviality that are associated with that specific remembrance of the past. These elements range from memories of friendly interconfessional neighborly relations to knowledge of one another's languages and syncretism in religious practice. In Istanbul, cosmopolitan nostalgia evokes memories of a tolerant, multi-ethnic, multi-religious old Istanbul of harmonious coexistence, which is contrasted with the new Istanbul, which is seen to be increasingly changing, increasingly losing its identity and becoming a city like any other city. Evidence of this peaceful coexistence is thought to be embedded deeply in the mahalles of the city, the neighborhoods of the city, where churches, synagogues, and mosques can be found just a stone's throw away from one another in seemingly blissful fraternity. In Istanbul in particular, cosmopolitan nostalgia gained popularity in various segments of society, appealing to both secular Democrats and Islamist conservatives alike. For secular-minded liberals and Democrats, the Ottoman past and an embrace of Istanbul's multiculturalism was seen as a powerful conduit for political change in the present day. An embrace of the country's non-Muslim communities and their history and heritage was understood to be a means to achieving integration in the European Union and for facilitating Turkey's democratization and westernization. For this reason, secular liberals and proponents of democratic pluralism began to highlight cosmopolitanism and diversity as an intrinsic and valuable source of identification. Books, movies, TV series, art installations, and documentaries produced by the secular-minded social class embraced themes of multiculturalism, often dealing for the first time with political topics pertaining to mistreatment and discrimination towards minorities, themes that had previously been deemed taboo in Turkish society. Gentrification projects in Istanbul in the last few decades have also favored the transformation of formerly non-Muslim neighborhoods into touristic and commercial spaces. The multiculturalism of these mahalles or neighborhoods has been highly commodified, with old Istanbul-themed shops, tavernas, restaurants, and cafes being opened throughout these neighborhoods. Ironically, as the scholar Sami Zubaydah remarks, many of these establishments with clearly Greek or Jewish names, such as the popular Victor Levy Wine House or the Stavros Taverna, are actually owned and run by Turkish Muslims. This indicates that as minority populations in the city have decreased, the Turkish Muslim majority has come to embrace the very identities that are subject to nostalgia. Other scholars have criticized the commodification of non-Muslim identity and spaces in this sense by noting that nostalgia for the cosmopolitan city does not address the problems different groups experienced in the past. Rather, for a genuine embrace of multiculturalism in the present day, it is necessary for the Turkish state and for other actors within Turkey to confront the undesirable elements in the history of minorities in the country, rather than solely engage in acts of selective commodification and heritagization. In this picture here, you see the Bulgarian church of Sveti Stefan, which is a very interesting church and a very unique church in the world because it's built entirely of cast iron. It was prefabricated in Vienna, shipped along the Danube to the Black Sea and then to Istanbul. And it was the sort of the base church, the most important church for the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, which gained its independence from the Greek Orthodox Church in the 19th century, I think in 1870, by decree of an Ottoman Sultan. This church was the center of Istanbul's lively Bulgarian community for decades, until sort of the onset of the Balkan Wars, 1912, 1914. Many of these Bulgarians moved away to the new Bulgarian nation state. And with the decline of the Bulgarian community in Istanbul, which now numbers around maybe 300 people, this church gradually became derelict. It was restored a few years ago. Its restoration began in 2011 and concluded in, I believe, 2018. But what was interesting was that at the opening ceremony of the church, Turkey's president, who funded a large part of the restoration through cultural heritage programs, gave a speech that sought to present Istanbul as a beacon of multiculturalism, employing discourses and instrumentalizing the heritage of minority groups to sort of push an image of a tolerant and diverse Turkey, which doesn't necessarily reflect the realities of the country, because his politics and his policies haven't necessarily dealt with the episodes, the undesirable episodes in Turkish history that led to the mass migration of minority groups from Turkey in the first place. In this sense, minority cultural heritage sites can be instrumentalized and can be politicized to sort of push certain political messages. Kulüp is an interesting Netflix show that came out last year and caused a major splash in Turkey for the first time ever, because TV shows like this aren't necessarily produced on Turkish mainstream TV. A Turkish TV show centered the lives of Turkish Jewish characters based in the 1950s. And this is sort of an example of cosmopolitan nostalgia reflected into cultural production. Kulüp, the club in English, you should all watch it on Netflix. Dealt with important questions regarding the history of Turkey's minority communities and Istanbul's minority communities, dealing with matters such as the Istanbul pogrom that took place in the 1950s, the wealth tax of 1942, and presented these to a larger audience for the first time. And this is sort of the product of that socially secular class that has been embracing cosmopolitan nostalgia for the past couple of decades. Interestingly, my prediction for cosmopolitan nostalgia in Istanbul is that it will continue to gain ground, which is ironic because the traditional non-Muslim communities of Turkey and of Istanbul, the Armenian, Greek, and Jewish communities are in demographic decline owing to migration and also an aging population in general. But the fact that Istanbul is still growing, receiving immigrants from all over the world, including many refugees, has sort of reinvigorated this process of cosmopolitan nostalgia being embraced by certain classes within the Turkish Muslim community. And what's really interesting is that some people from my generation, some people who aren't even from Istanbul, or some people who haven't necessarily experienced that sense of cosmopolitan conviviality in Istanbul, embracing this ideology and this idea that everything was so good back in the day when the non-Muslims were around, when they haven't necessarily experienced that, and they can choose to erase. By embracing that discourse, they can often erase the experiences that non-Muslims have actually had in Turkish history, modern Turkish history. I wanted to share another example of religious syncretism in the context of Istanbul, with this little church located in Istanbul's old city. It's very little known. I think other than locals, this is one of the few sites that haven't necessarily become commodified for tourists. Many locals, Christians, Muslims, and Jews visit this church on the 1st of every month. It's a very unique spot, and people come here and buy little tiny amulets, these little keys that are sold outside the entrance at the start of every month. There is a massive queue. It can sometimes take hours to get in. And it's mostly women who come here. A woman I spoke to when I went in the beginning of September told me that she is going to visit this church, as she does every single month, and then she heads straight to Eyüp, which is a popular Muslim pilgrimage site further out from the city center. So it's interesting to see how these forms of cosmopolitan coexistence still exist to some extent, and not all of it has become entirely commodified. And so once you get those little amulets, you sort of enter the church, you wait in a queue, and you rub it or sort of touch it onto all of these icons along the church, and then you can get some holy water, and then your wish is supposed to come true. You make a wish for each amulet, or you buy an amulet or a little token that represents something. It could be wealth, it could be success, it could be love. And then when it comes true, you're supposed to return to the first of the month church and give the key back. Or give that little token back. And once you do, if your wish does come true, you're supposed to bring sweets. So there's also lots of women sitting in the courtyard of the church distributing sweets. And what's really interesting is that the majority of women who take part in this tradition are actually Turkish Muslim women, which just shows how syncretism plays a large role, continues to play a large role in Istanbul today. Many people like to think that the syncretism of the late Ottoman Empire has sort of faded away. but also in Salonika, for decades after the Muslim population left, after the population exchange, Christian women continued to pray at Muslim holy sites that were left in the city, including tombs of saints. And before ending, I wanted to read this final quote regarding cosmopolitan nostalgia and regarding what the Turkish state must do in order to sort of deal with darker chapters in its history. Imagining that a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, diverse urban life happened in the past by looking at the places where it happened must occur together with a critical outlook on how and why those places were transformed and why non-Muslim minorities are now mostly gone. So that's the end of my presentation for today. I would be happy to take any Q&As. I'll be happy to do Q&A and to take any questions. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask separately, you can obviously contact me through my email, kenancruz@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter if Twitter manages to survive this tumultuous period, at Kenan Cruz. And I also have an Instagram page where I share pictures relating to Turkey's diverse multicultural heritage, which is Turkey Heritage Watch. Yeah, I'll leave the floor to you, Jacob.
Thank you so much, Kenan, for that really interesting presentation. I have a few questions, then I'll open up to the floor. In the meantime, yeah, people can put any questions in the chat as an alternative if they don't want to just turn on the mic. So I wanted to ask about I think the kind of generational question and connected to the restoration projects. So you mentioned that both the national government and municipal governments are active in sponsoring selectively some of these restoration projects of non-Muslim religious sites, for example. But I get the sense, particularly from your project, Turkey Heritage Watch, there are a lot of community organizations that are also raising funds in different ways or engaging in kind of efforts independently. So I guess I wanted to ask about maybe the generational question in relation to this kind of activism. How many younger people in Turkey, I mean, what maybe this links to the curriculum as well. So how would people gain exposure to this, and what kind of people would navigate themselves, you resident of Istanbul, into supporting some of these projects, getting involved?
It's an interesting question. The first thing we should think about is how minority heritage was dealt with from the foundation of the Republic until the 1980s. There was a long period that in many ways is still continuing throughout Anatolia, in which non-Muslim heritage sites, churches, Armenian churches in Anatolia, Greek churches, synagogues to a lesser extent, were deemed as sort of a threat to the Turkish identity and the Muslim identity of the state. Sevres syndrome was a big force in Turkish politics and continues to be a big force in the psyche of many Turkish people. And Sevres syndrome is this idea that Western powers and non-Muslims within Turkey seek to and conspire to dismantle the Turkish state and divide it into multiple different states, which is sort of divided among many other countries, Armenia and Greece. And Sevres syndrome led to this very nationalist, narrow-minded thinking that saw non-Muslim heritage sites as a threat to the country's national identity. So for decades, sites were vandalized, sites were purposefully demolished, and most sites were not taken care of in any way, shape, or form. Starting in the 1980s with the rise in tourism and the insertion of the private sector into heritagization processes, there was an increase, which continues to happen in the present day. I'd say in the last 10 years, there's been an astounding amount of churches throughout Western Turkey, Central Turkey, Southeast Turkey that have been restored at the hands of private actors. Rich families, foundations have restored many churches and turned them into museums. I can think of Ayvalık, for instance, a little town in Western Turkey, northwestern Turkey, where multiple churches just in the past few years were restored either by the Turkish state or by private actors. Obviously, when private actors are involved in the restoration of a site, it is mostly with the objective of turning the site into a tourist attraction. Whereas when the state does it, it's normally the prime objective is to push a discourse of tolerance. Generationally, I think there has obviously been a shift in the past, since the 1980s, but particularly in the past 10 years. And obviously a large part of that is tourism. I think different places have seen, for instance, in Konya, in the city of Konya, there's a little town called Sille, which used to be a Greek Orthodox town until the population exchange in the 1920s. That was one of the first churches to recently be restored. There was an abandoned church and it was restored by the municipality. I think they had a very open-minded mayor who thought this would be a good idea. They restored the church, and soon after, the place became a very popular tourist destination. I think other small towns throughout Anatolia saw that model and thought, oh, we can implement that as well. We have an abandoned church just there. Why not restore it, and why not see if we can sort of tap into the touristic potential of that? So for local municipalities and for private actors, yeah, there's definitely a profit mentality that inspires a lot of this restoration. But that shouldn't that doesn't mean necessarily that there aren't sort of private actors and funds, foundations that are genuinely interested in preserving these sites to reflect their history and to sort of highlight Turkey's cosmopolitanism. Generationally, I think, to get back to you, the core of your question, the best way to raise awareness about these different sites is, I guess, through platforms like this. I think the Club, for instance, that Netflix show, raised more awareness about the fact that Turkey has a Jewish community with a rich Jewish history to newer generations than decades of activism. I think people were Googling for the first time, many people my age were Googling for the first time, what is a Turkish Jew? Because it's something they'd never really heard of. And a lot of the episodes that dealt with in that series were complete novelty to people, because the wealth tax of 1942, for instance, isn't taught in Turkish textbooks or Turkish history classes. Neither is the Istanbul pogrom. So yeah.
Thank you so much. We have a question in the chat from SB van Herden Unsal. When I first moved to Turkey, people said to me, Turkish people love their history, but they hate old things. Would you agree?
It's an interesting question. Obviously, it's a bit of a generalizing statement, so I can't say I agree. I'm a Turkish person and I love old things, but obviously there are people who are less interested in old things. I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who aren't particularly interested in history. There's a lot of people who live and are surrounded by history, an astounding amount of history. Many of my friends in Istanbul, for instance, I am always sort of a little bit annoyed with them. I say, you're so fortunate to live in this city and you're surrounded by so much history, and you don't really seem to care. But obviously some people are interested and some people aren't. It would be great to have initiatives to raise more awareness regarding the rich history in the country. But yeah.
Yes. So I wanted to maybe ask about particularly the kind of the media strategy of the kind of the incumbent government. You mentioned the Netflix TV show focusing on the Turkish Jewish community, but I mean, I'm aware of a number of shows and very popular series produced in Turkey, which negotiate the 19th century, the late Ottoman period, by focusing on the court of the Sultan, or particular sultans like Abdulhamid II. So you might can these productions be considered in some way to exist in tension with kind of efforts to promote or kind of reflect on that cosmopolitan past? How do you think those programs might cause people in Turkey and others to kind of revisit that period and the ethnic diversity of those periods?
That's a very good question. I haven't personally watched any of those shows other than I guess a couple of episodes of The Magnificent Century when it came out perhaps a decade ago, when I was in high school. I'm not necessarily sure how much those shows accurately reflect Ottoman history, A, and B, the cosmopolitan nature of the Ottoman Empire. I think a lot of those shows are produced through a more nationalist lens. So they try to sort of fit the Ottoman Empire into a sort of a model that works to sort of create this sense of continuity between then and the Turkish nationalism of now. And I don't think they necessarily accurately depict. It's not surprising, but I don't think it's fiction at the end of the day, based on history, but there's a lot of fiction in it. I'm not even sure if there are non-Muslim characters in those TV series. Maybe perhaps if they are, they might often be the baddies. That wouldn't surprise me. So yeah, I'm not really sure.
I think again about focusing more on the urban politics dimension to this. You focus quite on one section on gentrification and the very selective restoration of certain sites, large-scale demolition of others. I guess I want to ask about sort of mobilization against these projects of demolition. How are they organized? How widespread, and is it possible to kind of build coalitions that will be able to promote a new form of development that brings this heritage in all its diversity to the fore? How viable do you think some of those initiatives might be?
That's a really good question as well. There's always been there've always been demonstrations against gentrification work in Istanbul, particularly in neighborhoods that were residential neighborhoods. The neighborhood in Galata was a little bit different because no one actually lived there. So it sort of happened overnight. The demolitions happened very, very quickly. And I don't think many people knew that they were even going to happen until they were suddenly announced. And 42 buildings, I think, were torn to the ground within a space of a few days. The case of a neighborhood that's sort of to the north of Taksim Square and Istiklal Street was subject to major demolitions in the 1980s. That area was home to Greeks before the 1960s, and later Kurds who came from Turkey's southeast, as well as a large Roma population. There were major demolitions there in the 1980s, and these were historic buildings in which people lived, to sort of build a new road that would connect Taksim Square to the Golden Horn. There were massive protests at that time, but as is the case in many authoritarian countries, though those protests were not, unfortunately, able to stop the demolition from happening. Today in Istanbul as well, gentrification continues, not necessarily in historic neighborhoods. All over the city, there's gentrification happening. Many of the cases of gentrification in the present day are done under the guise of making certain neighborhoods earthquake friendly. As you know, there's a big risk for an earthquake in Istanbul, but it's very sad to see the amount of buildings that are being destroyed and the amount of neighborhoods that are being razed under the guise of preparing the city for a massive earthquake, but also engaging with large companies and stakeholders who end up creating massive development projects, huge skyscrapers that then push out local residents. And this obviously disproportionately impacts minority communities, particularly Roma communities. Yeah, it's quite sad.
Thanks so much. So I want to now kind of look ahead to maybe the next elections in Turkey. You showed some of the newspaper headlines there describing the incumbent mayor of Istanbul from the main opposition party, and kind of sympathetic or alluding that he is Greek because he's kind of restoring Byzantine heritage. So what role do you think this kind of rhetoric over a national identity, and particularly cosmopolitanism, will play in the next Turkish elections, and I guess to how Turkey will continue to or change its approach to foreign policy and how it projects itself abroad?
Something noteworthy about the comments that were sort of aimed at the backlash that İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, received, is that if you go back 15 years in time, the same nationalist and this time secular newspapers would be making similar comments about the current president, about President Erdogan. Turkish nationalism is one of the greatest forces in Turkish politics, and it comes in many shapes and sizes and many different forms on the secular side of the spectrum, as well as the more religious and conservative side of the spectrum. So interestingly, for instance, in 2005, when Erdogan embarked on the so-called Armenian process, which was this process to establish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Armenia and sort of deal with questions regarding the Armenian genocide, Erdogan restored an abandoned Armenian church in the city of Van in eastern Turkey on an island called Aktomar in Lake Van. That church was restored, and he received so much backlash from not only CHP politicians, but also MHP politicians who are today his partners in government. So it's interesting. It's very interesting to see how those labels and the Turkish flip-flops is a story of the Turkish politics is a story of flip-flopping, constant flip-flopping, constant changing of positions and twists and turns. I don't necessarily think cultural heritage will play a large role in the upcoming elections next year. I think there are more pressing issues in the minds of many Turkish people. The economic crisis it has been impacting everyone, and that will probably be the main sort of point of discussion and debate. I do think the person will has intentions to turn, and he's already showing intentions to turn the election into more of a culture war. Regarding issues such as secularism, the headscarf, the role of the headscarf, LGBT people, the LGBT community, and he knows that there's a majority of conservative thinking Turkish people in the electorate, and he wants to sort of stoke a culture war which will help him win the elections. In that framework, it is likely that he might bring up something like the restoration of the reconversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, but the opposition is too weak and frail and too scared, quite frankly, to even voice opposition towards certain things like that. For instance, when the Hagia Sophia, one of the most enduring symbols of Atatürk's legacy, was reconverted into a mosque, the CHP didn't really make a statement about it. They sort of welcomed it, or they sort of ignored it, sort of so as not to stoke those culture wars. And but by sort of constantly allowing the government to act without those checks and balances, it sort of gives the government a free rein to do what it likes in regards to cultural heritage.
So we have a question on again, these large scale demolition efforts, will they succeed in removing the kind of identities and cultural identity of cosmopolitanism from memories too? You mentioned how this has fluctuated, right? The salience of minority memory in Turkish society, whether it's through efforts of mayors or TV shows even. So what do you think these will this destruction itself will just over time naturally be able to kind of erode that memory?
No, I don't think so. I think there have been efforts in Istanbul to sort of change the face of the city for over a century now. When the Turkish Republic was founded, Istanbul was seen as this idea, this place of decadence, this former imperial city, which is a big cosmopolitan place with large non-Muslim populations, very non-Turkish, which was one of the main reasons why early Republicans wanted to move the capital to Ankara. However, 100 years have gone past, and Istanbul continues to be seen in the way that it was once seen. Obviously, things have changed and a lot has disappeared, but a lot remains. And memories in larger cities tend to linger for longer. And in the same way that, for instance, minority heritage was being threatened for decades and decades and decades, now with the surge of cosmopolitan nostalgia, that sort of comes back to the fore. So in places like Zürafa Sokak and in Galata, the memory of the sex workers and the prostitutes who worked in that area might be erased physically at the moment, but that doesn't mean to say that in 20 years there won't be sort of art projects and exhibitions and sort of perhaps even a site of memory dedicated to their specific memories. So things come and things go, but I don't think it will necessarily disappear.
Thanks so much, Kenan. I think we're concluding there on a hopeful note about the ability of communities and activists to continue to reinterpret and challenge the dominant narratives in relation to heritage in cities. So thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Really appreciate your time today, and thank you to everyone for joining us. As I mentioned before, this conversation will be published on our social media pages, so you'll be able to all follow up and listen again to, I think, what was a really informative and interesting presentation. So thank you so much, Kenan, for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.